Greetings. Welcome. I'm Pastor Diana Thompson. I'm the called pastor at the Canton City Lutheran Parish in Canton, Ohio, and the administrative pastor at St. Paul's Lutheran Church in Alliance, Ohio. Thank you for joining me today. We are in episode 31 in our Bible study of the Acts of the Apostles, sometimes called the Book of Acts. If you have come across this video randomly, welcome. I do believe the Spirit works in mysterious ways, and I hope that this episode is fulfilling for you. But you're also welcome to go to the YouTube channel and start this series from the beginning, whatever is calling to you. If you are one of my regulars, you know this next part. I invite you to have a few tools. One, a Bible, translation of your choice, digital or printed, and then paper and a pen or pencil. The Bible is to help you follow along where we are in the text, but the other two are to help you write down notes, ideas, inspirations. If you're a doodler, doodle on that page. If you are struck and need to pause and write a poem or a piece of music or whatever, you use that page as you need. If you're not a note taker, it's okay. Use it however you need. So I encourage you to have those items with you. So in our episode today, we're going to conclude chapter 21 and begin chapter 22. We're going to hear the story of Paul's arrest in the temple, and then Paul defending himself before the Jews in Jerusalem. So we're in chapter 21, starting at verse 21, through chapter 22, ending at verse 21. So we'll be covering over a couple chapters. In the Gospel of Luke and the book of Acts, there are 6 themes that run in and out of the stories. And not every story touches on all these themes, but they come up again and again. So those are God's redemptive purposes, salvation for all alike, the blessings of poverty and the dangers of wealth, table fellowship, the role of a disciple, and the importance of an accurate witness. So we're going to look back at the end of our episode to see which of these that Luke, that Luke lifted up in these stories. And I use the name Luke because it's believed that the Gospel of Luke and the book of Acts are actually 2 parts of the same story. One because of the consistent theme, one because of consistent use of language between the two, and the way that they dovetail and are addressed to the same student, which is Theophilus, a lover of God. So these are why we consider these 2 parts of the same story. So some general notes before we jump into our text today. Remember, Paul is now in Jerusalem. He came in time to attend the Pentecost, and that is 50 days after the Passover. So what we see here is Paul now getting pushback from Jerusalem Jews, and he then this is actually the start of 4 kind of episodic events where Paul defends himself in front of various people in Jerusalem. So there's the Jews, there's the Roman government, there's multiple groups. So Paul now has to share his story again and again. But what this tells us is that Luke is shaping these 4 stories to lift up kind of the big ideas and the images that we as the listeners and readers should keep in mind. So in this section of Acts, not just here in chapter 21, 22, but over the next 4 defense stories of Paul, we see that he is offering speeches of apology. And again, apology is not a sorry, which is how we use the word apology today. Apology is a defense of what one believes and how one acts. So these are speeches. They are not meant to be exhortations. They're not meant to be sermons that bring conversion. This is Paul defending who he is, why he's done what he's done, and why he believes that this is the work of God. So it's very important. These are going to be different than his missionary speeches. So just pay attention to that reality. But what we see in all of them is Paul's enduring commitment to Israel. He is a Jew through and through. He is not watering down his understanding of faith. He was raised in the Pharisaic tradition, which is very law-centered, and he still follows those laws. He just recognizes that they're not for everyone who comes in to the Christian community, especially from the Gentile contingency. So he's not telling Jews to stop being Jews, but he's saying, you know what, we can't expect Gentiles to become Jews to become followers of Christ. They don't have to do all of those things. Now, he's not saying that if you're Jewish that you get to just let those things go. So this is that fine line that Paul walks, and part of why rumors are spreading about who he is and what he's teaching, especially to the Jews that live outside Jerusalem. And because he is so active in inviting Gentiles into this Christian faith. So the first story we're going to hear today is Paul's arrest in the temple and his conversation when the Roman guards actually take custody of him. So we are in chapter 21. We're in verses 27 through 36. And let me read the story for you, and then we will break it down a little bit. When the 7 days were almost completed, the Jews from Asia who had seen him in the temple stirred up the whole crowd. They seized him, shouting, "Fellow Israelites, help! This is the man who is teaching everyone everywhere against our people, our law, and this place. More than that, he has actually brought Greeks into the temple and defiled this holy space." For they had previously seen Trophimus, the Ephesian, with him in the city, and they supposed that Paul had brought him into the temple. Then all the city was aroused, and the people rushed together. They seized Paul and dragged him out of the temple, and immediately the doors were shut. While they were trying to kill him, word came to the tribune of the cohort that all Israel was in an uproar. Immediately he took soldiers and centurions and ran down to them. When they saw the tribune and the soldiers, they stopped beating Paul. And I said tribune, but it's tribune. Then the tribune came, arrested him, and ordered him to be bound with 2 chains. He inquired who he was and what he had done. Some in the crowd shouted one thing, some another. And as he could not learn the facts because of the uproar, he ordered Paul to be brought into the barracks. When Paul came to the steps, the violence of the mob was so great, he had to be carried by the soldiers. The crowd that followed kept shouting, "Away with him!" Just as Paul was about to be brought into the barracks, I need to stop there. So we're in verses 27 through 36. So this is just Paul's arrest, not his first defense. So what happens here, of course, Paul goes into the temple to do what is appropriate for him as he is preparing for the Pentecost and doing all the rituals and things obligated by law. And Jews from Asia. So we have to assume these are people who interacted or saw Paul in action in Ephesus and other places in Asia. And of course, they are the ones who are in opposition to him. They are the ones who are upset that Paul was able to invite Jews away from the synagogue and into this followers of Jesus community. And remember, Ephesus is a huge epicenter of Christian faith in Asia. So Paul is well known. So they're the ones that these Jews from Asia are actually the ones who create the problem. Paul is going about his own business, doing what is expected of him as a Jew in preparation for Pentecost. So these Jews stir up trouble. They rabble-rouse the crowd. And if you remember, this is one of the activities that has happened to Paul in many places, but also happened to Jesus, especially in Jerusalem, where people would rabble-rouse and create problems so that the temple leaders, the temple police, the Roman government had to step in and extricate Paul and Jesus from these troubling situations, and then creating opportunities for Jesus and now Paul to speak to the Roman leaders about who they are and what's going to happen, which is actually Paul's first defense in the next section of today's episode. So they're opposing to Paul. They're stirring up the crowds. And one of the things to remember is, we tend to get really prickly, and our passion and our desire for everything to be perfect around holidays is not uncommon. And this would not have been uncommon here in Pentecost. There's lots of pilgrims in Jerusalem for the Pentecost, just as there would have been lots of pilgrims there for the Passover. So they want to make sure everything is perfect. They don't want the temple to be considered unclean, because then they can't do the rites and rituals that they know they need to do as part of their pilgrimage. So they stir up rabble-rousing him, and literally they lay their hands on Paul. They grab him, they take him. We often translate it to seize, but literally it means put hands on, laid hands on him. And then of course they encourage the crowd to help them. Let us capture him. And one of the things that they accuse Paul of is making the temple unclean by bringing a Jew into the temple, which is blatantly untrue. There's no indication that any Gentiles have entered the temple. Yes, it says that he was seen with a Greek person prior to this, but it doesn't say that person was in the temple. And Paul, as a faithful, law-abiding Jew, a Pharisee, would never have done that. That is completely outside of what he would have done. Nor would he have expected this Greek Christian to come to the temple and go through the temple purity issues. This is important, and the law is very clear here. If any Gentile enters the sanctuary, enters past a particular set of gates, what would be beyond the gates of the court of Gentiles, they actually, by law, Jewish law and Roman law, could be killed. That this would be a cause for death. So this was a way for the purity of the temple to be maintained by not having, quote, the unclean people inside, but also the fact that the Roman government allowed for this death penalty to be maintained under their ruling meant that they really did want to make sure that the Jews did not have cause for uprising and for struggle, honoring this Jewish tradition. And in the temple there would have been stone slabs that were written in both Latin and Greek that were warning anyone who came in there, if they were not Jewish, that they would be killed. So this is a really important charge, and a scary charge for someone to make against Paul. But the other charge is the one that was the rumors that had been circulating, that he wasn't teaching Jews to be Jewish. He wasn't teaching Jews to follow law. He was watering down Jewish teachings for those who were Jewish because Gentiles were coming into the community, which again, Paul has reiterated again and again. He is not telling Jews not to practice purity laws. He's not telling them to forego circumcision. He's not telling them any of those things. But yet the rumor persists because there is this influx of Gentile Christians into the community. So again, the rabble-rousers create problems. And in verse 30 through 36, I mean, there's this violent response. It's highly reactive. The accusations create all sorts of trouble, and this is basically a riot is starting. And so the Roman tribune, I want to say tribune, not tribune, tribune, comes with soldiers and centurions to put down this trouble, because again, as I've said in other episodes, whenever there is an uprising in one of the small, in a local community, the emperor would put all the fault of that on the appointed rulers from the Roman Empire. So it was well within their best interest and good practice to quell violence quickly and decisively, so that they wouldn't get this report going out to Rome that says, you got a whole city that's out of control. Now, clearly, this is still somewhat isolated, but as we know, riots can spread. They can become contagious, so to speak. They start in one spot, and other people start feeding off of that energy. They may not even know what started it or even have a reason, but they feed off that energy, that fear, and so they move forward. So when the soldiers and centurions come, the Jewish crowd that had laid hands on Paul and were starting to beat him stepped away. They did allow Paul to be taken away by the soldiers, and this tribune wanted to come and see what was going on. He wanted to know what was happening. So he did have Paul bound, because clearly it felt like this was the epicenter of what was going on. But as it says in verse 34, when the tribune was trying to figure out what was happening, some people in the crowd were saying something and other people were saying other things. So even in the mob, they don't really know what's going on. They just know that something's happening, and they want to make sure that their concerns are heard. So Paul is taken away in chains. Now the barracks for the soldiers were up some stairs from the temple. And the concern was this mob was so angry that literally the soldiers were carrying Paul. They were trying to whisk him away as quickly as possible to quell the crowd. And the crowd's response as Paul is being taken away is away with him, which is another way of saying kill him. They want him dead. And this is, again, the same words that were said to Jesus. They would say, away with him, crucify him, away with him. They wanted him killed. They wanted the Roman government to silence this person. And so this is where we find ourselves as we start moving forward. Now remember, Agabus in chapter 21 had offered a prophecy that Paul would be bound with 2 chains, which again we see in verse 33. So again, the prophecy is being fulfilled. As you notice, Paul is not arguing his innocence. He's not fighting against the crowd. He understands that what is happening is part of what God calls him to do. Remember, he knew that when he went to Jerusalem, he would be arrested. He knew that he would have to defend himself as an act of his faith. And so here is the circumstances coming about. So his job now was to accept the nature of what was happening, just like Jesus. When he went up to Jerusalem, he knew he would be arrested. He knew he would be crucified. Now again, in Paul's story, he's arrested, but he is not crucified because he still has more work to do outside of Jerusalem and Palestine. So again, we're moving away from this reality. We're coming to the conclusion that, again, Paul is taken up by the soldiers into the barracks, one for Paul's protection and one for the tribune to find the authority and determine who, excuse me, to determine what was really going on. So we now move into chapter 21, verses 37 through chapter 22, verse 5, where Paul defends himself first in front of the Roman tribune and then ultimately before the Jerusalem Jews. So we're going to start in that process. So let me read for you again chapter 21, verses 37 through chapter 22, verse 5. Just as Paul was about to be brought into the barracks, he said to the tribune, "May I say something to you?" The tribune replied, "Do you know Greek?" then you are not the Egyptian who recently stirred up a revolt and led the 4,000 assassins out into the wilderness." Paul replied, "I am a Jew from Tarsus in Cilicia, a citizen of an important city. I beg you, let me speak to the people." When he had given him permission, Paul stood on the steps and motioned to the people for silence. Then there was a great hush, and he addressed them in the Hebrew language, saying, "Brothers and fathers, listen to the defense that I now make before you." When they heard him addressing them in Hebrew, they became even more quiet. Then he said, "I am a Jew, born in Tarsus in Cilicia, but brought up in this city at the feet of Gamaliel, educated strictly according to our ancestral law, being zealous for God, just as all of you are today. I persecuted this way up to the point of death by binding both men and women and putting them in prison, as the high priest and the whole council of elders can testify about me. From them I also received letters to the brothers in Damascus, and I went there in order to bind those who were there and to bring them back to Jerusalem for punishment." So again, we just have the start of actually what is Paul's first speech here. So he interacts with the tribune, and this is an interesting and important note that Paul speaks to the tribune in Greek. And the tribune is surprised because he didn't expect necessarily that this person would speak to him in Greek, but it's helpful that he did, because in that we find out that the tribune is concerned that he was one who had led a rebellion in Egypt and had now come to Jerusalem to cause trouble, which he determined quickly was not the case. He didn't have an Egyptian accent to his Greek. He was fluent in Greek. So Paul introduced who he said, who he was, how he came to be. But it also, though it doesn't state it specifically, also underlines the fact that Paul was a person of influence in Tarsus. So this was important for that process. And then, of course, Paul makes a request to now address the crowd that not long before was rioting against him. And so then we start in chapter 22 with the beginning address to this crowd. And he addresses it brothers and fathers. So again, this would be men, because that would have been all that would have been welcomed into the center of the temple. And he says, "I am going to make a defense of myself. I'm going to defend what you are charging me against." And so he starts with the story of who he is. He's Jewish. He's from Tarsus, so he is a diaspora Jew. But then he says, "But here's my true credentials. I was raised in this city, and I was taught by Gamaliel." Remember, this would have been the same Gamaliel that would have been part of that Sanhedrin conversation, the one who said, let's not make this big stink about this Christian community, these people of the way, these followers of Jesus, because if it's of God, there's nothing we can do about it. And if it isn't from God, it'll die of its own weight. It will fail on its own. So by naming Gamaliel, Paul, one, emphasizes that he's part of the Pharisaic teachings, that he is known to the Sanhedrin or the council. And then, of course, he goes on to say he was strictly educated according to the ancestral law, again, affirming his Pharisaic background, and that he's zealous for God. Now, this is an interesting change, because usually it's zealous for the law. So Paul's change to that is important. But again, he doesn't say that as an oppositional piece to the crowd there. He says, just like all of you, we're zealous in doing what God calls of us. And then he goes on to say, I was the one who was persecuting the people of the way. I was the one who was arresting people. And I was actually on my way to Damascus with a letter giving me the authority to arrest and bring people to Jerusalem for trial. This is who I was. And this is his way of saying, your arguments against me aren't what you think they are. And then in our next episode, we're going to talk about, he tells of his conversion. He he talks about why he was sent to the Gentiles. He spends then more time with the Roman tribune. And so this is where Paul is going in his conversations in Jerusalem. So obviously, in this perspective, there's really not much that the Roman government would have to do with this. Paul's, the concerns being brought forward from the crowd about Paul have more to do with religion than Roman law. So again, this, just like in other places where Paul is brought before the Roman authorities, they keep saying this is a religious issue, this is a theology issue, this is a thing that needs to be dealt with within your religious tradition. And Paul is saying the same thing here. And actually none of the charges that Paul was being accused of, undermining the law for those who are Jewish, or even the argument that he brought a Gentile into the sacred space of the temple, are Roman issues. These aren't Roman issues. These are religious issues. So the Roman tribune is not going to be really concerned about those at this point. So this is really the important process. Now, I think it's interesting when you look at this, in verse chapter 22, verse 1 and 2, he quiets them with a gesture. So it's really interesting how even if they're standing in opposition to Paul, they still recognize some authority. He quiets them with a gesture, but then as he continues to speak, he addresses that by addressing them in Hebrew. He really causes them to listen. He speaks to them in the language that is most familiar to them, and he really is using the language that would best defend him when he's talking about the Jewish faith and his life as a Jew. So again, we see a similar credentials laid out by Paul as the ones that he had listed to the tribune. He's a Jew born in Tarsus, but then he moves on to what would be meaningful to the Jewish community, to listening, as I said, training under Gamaliel, being zealous for the law, all of these things that Paul said that he was rigorous in his Jewish learning and continues to be rigorous in his life of faith. So then he closes this section really, saying, let me tell you who I was, so you know where I come from. I was one of the enforcers, for lack of a better word. He was one of the enforcers for the council against these people that were following Jesus. So to accuse him of wanting the temple to be unclean, to accuse him of undermining or weakening the Jewish traditions really didn't stand. So those were his defense. As we continue in the next episode, again, we're in chapter 22, starting at verse 6, and we'll get through most of chapter 22. And Paul continues this conversation, this speech, this defense of who he is, first by telling of his conversion, and again, then telling of his call to go to the Gentiles. So these are the things that we will be looking at in our next episode. So let's go back to the themes that were lifted up according to Luke's 6 themes. So first, God's redemptive purposes. I would say that this isn't really a key part of this. This is really more about Paul anchoring himself in the tradition that he knows so well, to continue to be faithful to the law that he holds dear to himself. Second, salvation for all alike. This is, again, not one of the key things that he is talking about in these stories, though obviously he is associating with Greeks. So there is that piece, but that's not the key message happening here. And actually, the crowds are the ones who are actually standing in opposition to this opportunity for salvation for all people. So that is like the closest contact or context for this. The blessings of poverty and the dangers of wealth are not part of the story here. Table fellowship also does not continue to be part of the story. The role of a disciple, definitely here. Paul doing what he knows God is calling him to do and being who God calls him to be, even though he has physically hostile pushback against who he is and what he is called to do. And then the importance of an accurate witness is really more about how Luke anchors the stories in history and the events and in the community. And again, with Paul coming back to do his pilgrimage during Pentecost, he once again anchors this in kind of the calendar, the cyclical life of faith in the Jewish community. So these were all of the stories for today's episode. It's a little bit shorter episode, but there was no way to do all of this Paul's defense in one episode. There's too much in here. So we're going to continue Paul's speech to the Jewish community in our next episode. Again, we will cover chapters 22, verse 6 through 29. And Paul will tell of his conversion, of his being sent to the Gentiles, and then we hear Paul's conversation with the Roman tribune. So this is where we'll be next week. But I want to thank you for joining me today. If you have any questions, reflections, comments, please post them on the YouTube channel. If you prefer a more private conversation, you're welcome to reach out to me on my social media or my email, which you'll see coming up at the end of this video. As always, grace and peace to you, my dear Theophilus. God is with you.